There's something small in the season 8 finale that I keep coming back to. After Rick slashes Negan's throat and calls for a medic, after the war, after Glenn, after everything, the camera drops to the ground, and there she is. Lucille, the bat, still wrapped in barbed wire, still stained, set aside in the grass like something that simply wasn't needed anymore. Not destroyed, not buried, preserved. Glenn Rhee is in the ground. Negan is getting stitched up, breathing, already arguing. And that bat, the thing that ended Glenn's life while his wife watched, just rests there in the dirt, waiting. It's a small image, easy to miss. But it stopped me cold the first time I really looked at it. Because here's the question that image quietly asks. In this world, what survives? And more uncomfortably, what exactly does it take to be the thing that does? Think about who The Walking Dead asks you to love first. Before any of the walls go up, before the alliances and the wars, the show hands you certain people and says, care about these ones. Glenn Rhee is one of them. A pizza delivery guy from before the world ended, quick-footed and warm and almost unbearably decent. He lowers ropes for strangers. He goes on the runs nobody else will take. He calls out over the radio to a man he doesn't know. Rick lost and panicking in an overrun Atlanta tank. Because the voice sounded scared and he thought he could help. That's Glenn. That's who he is from the very first episode he appears in. He helps because he can, not because he's calculating the return. And the show gives him years. It protects him mostly. It builds him a love story, a marriage, a child on the way. It makes you love him more deeply than you expected to love a character on a horror show. And then, in the season 7 premiere, it kills him in the most brutal way the show has ever staged. Negan chooses him. Not entirely at random, but partly because Glenn lunged forward, because he couldn't hold himself still, because the caring in him moved his body before his survival instincts could stop it. He died as he lived. And the show knows that. The camera knows that. Every frame of that sequence is constructed to make you feel exactly what it costs to be Glenn Rhee. Now think about Dale Horvath, Season 2. Dale is the group's conscience. Not in a preachy way, but in the way of someone who remembers what civilization asked of people and refuses to let that memory go quietly. When the group debates what to do with Randall, a young man they've captured, who may or may not be dangerous, when Dale is the one who argues for his life, he goes from person to person, in the dark, asking them to choose something harder than fear. He fails. The group votes for execution, and then, almost immediately, the show has Dale walk out into a field, alone, and get torn open by a walker. He doesn't even see it coming. There's no last stand, there's no heroic sacrifice. He's just gone, shortly after the world overruled him one final time. Here's the pattern worth sitting with. The characters who function as the group's moral compass tend to have the shortest survival windows. They're not killed because they're weak. Glenn was resourceful. Dale was perceptive. Herschel was wise. They're killed because the show keeps demonstrating, season after season, that the world doesn't reward what they represent. It rewards something else. And that something else is what we're going to trace tonight. Together, all the way from the Atlanta tank to the streets of New York. Lucille appears in this chapter not as herself, but as the shadow she casts. The bat exists before we ever see it. In the logic the show is already building. That the instrument of ending is what endures, while the warmth it extinguishes does not. Glenn is gone. The bat is still in the grass. And somewhere in that juxtaposition, the show's already asking us a question it won't answer for a long time yet. Is The Walking Dead punishing virtue? Or is it doing something more uncomfortable? showing us with uncomfortable accuracy what the world punishes. Those aren't the same question. One is a criticism of the show, the other is a mirror, and I think the show knows exactly which one it's holding up. Let's talk about who survives. Not just who lives through a single season, but who the franchise keeps choosing to return to. Year after year, spin-off after spin-off. As if to say, this one is the shape of survival. Negan is alive in Dead City. He was alive through seasons 7, 8, 9, 10 and 11. He survived the fall of the Sanctuary, survived imprisonment, survived the Whisperer War, survived the Commonwealth Arc. He's been a prisoner, a gardener, a reluctant warrior, a man in a new city trying to outrun the version of himself that swung a bat. He keeps going. The show keeps bringing him back, keeps finding new contexts for him, keeps asking what a person like Negan does next. Carol Pelletier is alive in the spin-off arc. She began season 1 as a woman so diminished by abuse that she barely registered as a presence in the group's survival. She's now one of the most dangerous, strategically intelligent, emotionally complex survivors in the entire franchise. She got there by making choices that Dale would have found monstrous. The Terminus sequence in Season 5's premiere, where she arrives alone in a walker herd, draped in camouflage and systematically dismantles a facility from the outside, is the show's most complete portrait of what survival looks like when it has been fully accepted as its own justification. Daryl Dixon is in France. The franchise trusted him enough to carry an entire spin-off on his shoulders, alone in a foreign country, years after the world ended. He's been the group's tracker and hunter and backup plan since season 1, and he never burnished that role with speeches or declarations. He just showed up and kept showing up, and the show kept him alive because he was indispensable in exactly the way the world in Dispensation values. Capable of violence without requiring permission. Now look at who isn't here. Andrea, who tried to broker peace and was destroyed by it. Merle, who had the ruthlessness but lacked the discipline. The Governor, who dominated for 2 seasons. Who seemed for a while like the show's argument that cruelty was its own reward, until the story needed the prison arc to end and took him with it. Even the Governor's extended reign is instructive. He lasted as long as he was narratively useful, and when his purpose was served, he was removed. The show doesn't reward cruelty blindly. It rewards a specific kind of adaptable ruthlessness. The kind that can be aimed, not just discharged. What does it take to still be standing in this story after 11 seasons and multiple spin-offs? I think the evidence is suggesting something specific. Not pure goodness, but the graveyard is full of that. Not pure evil, the Governor didn't make it. Something in between. Something that can hold kindness and violence in the same hands and choose, moment to moment, which one the situation requires. And the show keeps its most long-lived characters in exactly that middle space. Never entirely one thing, capable of both, tilted by circumstance. If you had to choose tonight between being Glenn or being Negan, just on the basis of what the show tells you survival requires, which one would you pick? I'm genuinely asking. Drop it in the comments, if you are awake enough to type, because I think the answer most people give, honestly, tells you something important about what The Walking Dead has been teaching us all along. One season at a time. So gradually we almost didn't notice. And that's where the pattern starts to click. Or at least it might. Rick Grimes cuts Negan's throat in the season 8 finale and immediately calls for a medic. That sequence, the slash, the fall, the shout for help, is one of the most contested moments in the entire franchise. Maggie's response is visceral and completely understandable. She screams. She fights against the people holding her back. She demands to know why. Why is he alive? Why does Negan get to breathe when Glenn doesn't? The look on her face in that moment carries years of grief, and a grief logic that's impossible to argue with. She's right. And Rick is also doing what Carl asked him to do. And both things are true at the same time. And the show lets the tension between them stay unresolved. Carl's death in season 8 is the emotional hinge that the Mercy decision rests on. Before he goes, Carl writes letters. He asks his father to try for a different kind of future. One where Negan might eventually be part of something rather than simply ended. Carl had spoken to Siddiq, a stranger Rick had turned away, and in that interaction seen something his father had stopped being able to access. The idea that not everyone is a threat. His Mercy vision is sincere and moving, and cost him nothing because he won't be alive to see whether it works or fails. Rick is the one who has to carry it forward. Rick is the one who has to look at Maggie's face. Herschel Green understood Mercy at a cellular level. In season 2, when the group discovers Herschel has been keeping walkers in his barn, including members of his family, neighbours he once knew, his logic is the logic of a man who hasn't yet accepted what the world has become. He still believes with his whole heart that a cure is coming, and that the dead can be helped rather than destroyed. Shane tears that apart. The barn sequence ends in horror. Herschel loses his faith in the possibility of return, but he doesn't lose his faith in the necessity of decency. He keeps trying to hold on to what civilization asked of people, even as the world keeps refusing to honour that ask. He pays for it twice. First, his leg. In the prison, a walker bite that could have been his death and instead becomes an amputation in one of the show's most harrowing early sequences. Then his life. In the season 4 mid-season finale, the governor finds Herschel in the field between the prison gates and uses him as leverage. What's unbearable about that scene isn't just the death, it's the moment before it. Herschel is talking. He's making the case, one more time, for the possibility of peaceful resolution. He's still trying. And the governor answers with a sword. The cell window is our motif here. Introduced through Negan's imprisonment after the season 8 finale. He sits in a cell beneath Alexandria. There's a window. Light comes through. And for seasons that window is the physical form Mercy takes in this story. Negan contained but not ended, able to see the world he ravaged but not to touch it, kept alive as an argument that the world could be something other than pure destruction. It's Mercy made architectural. And like most Mercy in this story, it cost the person who granted it considerably more than it cost the person who received it. Maggie carries that cost across years. She carries it into Dead City, into every hard decision she makes as a leader, into the specific way she holds her grief about Glenn. Not as a wound that healed, but as a wound she learned to function around. The Mercy Rick extended, in Carl's name, restructured Maggie's entire relationship with the group's leadership. It cost trust. It cost certainty. It cost the clean, satisfying end that grief sometimes needs to begin releasing. Does the show believe Mercy is noble? I genuinely think it does, but it keeps presenting Mercy's invoice. The specific, itemised cost of choosing to extend it in a world that punishes that extension. Mercy isn't free here. It's just sometimes worth paying for, and whether the payments ever balance out is the question the show keeps deferring, season after season, without quite answering. Beth Green sings. It's one of the show's most distinctive quietnesses. In the middle of the horror, in the middle of the grief, Beth picks up a guitar or sits at a piano and sings. In the season 4 episode Still, she and Daryl are alone in the post-prison chaos, surviving day by day, and she insists on finding alcohol and doing something that feels like living rather than just enduring. She makes moonshine out of peach schnapps. She makes Daryl tell stories. She refuses, stubbornly and beautifully, to let the world flatten her into pure survival function. She still wants to feel things. She still believes that wanting to feel things is worth protecting. By the season 5 mid-season finale, she's in Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta, a facility run by Officer Dawn Lerner, who has built a system of coercion dressed up as rescue. People are brought in, saved, and then told they owe a debt to the hospital for saving them. It's slavery with paperwork. It's the old world's power structures, reconstituted inside four walls, which is something The Walking Dead returns to repeatedly, and which we'll get to in the Commonwealth arc. Beth sees it clearly. She's been inside it long enough to understand exactly what it is. And she fights it. Quietly. Persistently. In the specific way available to people who don't have weapons but have will. She dies in an exchange, a negotiation that was almost working. She pulls a pair of scissors, a small symbolic gesture of resistance, and Dawn shoots her, almost reflexively, and Beth is gone before the echo of the shot clears. It's abrupt. It's almost arbitrary in terms of plot mechanics. She had survived so much to get to that hallway. And then a reflex. Dawn Lerner survives longer. She built a system of control and lived inside it and bent people around her needs. She's not a villain in the cartoonish sense. She has her own rationalizations, her own version of the story where she's doing what needs doing. But she runs a coercive institution, and the show keeps her alive and functioning considerably past the point where Beth's goodness runs out. The pattern is subtle but worth naming. The Walking Dead tends to use its hope carriers the way stories use candles. They're brightest right before the dark comes. Beth's warmth, her singing, her stubbornness, her insistence that feelings still matter, is most luminous in the episodes just before her death, as if the show is asking you to look carefully at what you're about to lose. And then it takes it. Not as punishment, exactly. Not as a message that hope is worthless, but as a recurring demonstration of what hope costs when the world decides it can't afford you. What does it mean that Beth's death felt almost inevitable? That many viewers, even as they hoped for her, suspected it was coming. I think it means the show had trained us well enough by season 5 to recognise the pattern. We knew, without being told explicitly, that certain kinds of characters had a ceiling in this story, that the ones who sang didn't tend to survive into the later seasons, that warmth, unprotected by pragmatism, was a kind of exposure. The show made us fluent in its own grammar of survival, and that fluency is uncomfortable, because it means we absorbed something the show was quietly teaching us all along. Here's the question I want to leave you with from this chapter, and I genuinely love your thoughts in the comments. If you were writing The Walking Dead, would you have let Beth live? And if she had survived, do you think she would have stayed Beth? Or would she have had to become something harder to make it? Because that question, I think, is at the centre of everything we're exploring tonight. The show keeps asking whether kindness can endure, and then it keeps showing us what happens when it tries. There's a field between the prison fences and the tree line where the governor positions himself in the season 4 mid-season finale. And it's one of those locations in the show that becomes permanently meaningful from the moment something happens there. Herschel is kneeling in that field. His hands are bound. And the governor is giving a speech. Because the governor always gives speeches. Always frames his violence inside a structure of argumentation that sounds just barely like reason. Herschel's not silent. Even kneeling, even facing what he has to understand is a real possibility of death. He tries, he says, and this is the line that lands like something final, that they can all still come back. that there's still a way for this to be something other than destruction. He's looking at the governor while he says it. He means it entirely. The mercy he's extending in that moment isn't weakness. It's the last full articulation of everything Herschel Green ever believed. The governor raises Michonne's sword. Herschel closes his eyes. What the show does with Herschel's death is among its most deliberate and painful choices. He doesn't die in the middle of something else, collaterally, the way many characters do. He dies at the centre of a standoff, in full view of everyone, at the exact moment he is making his most complete case for the possibility of peace. The governor's response is the show's response. In this world, that argument ends this way, not because it's wrong, because the world can't afford it. This is the thematic echo The Walking Dead returns to with remarkable consistency. Civilization building, the patient work of creating institutions, of extending trust before it's fully earned, of choosing diplomacy over force, tends to get people killed. Herschel building a functional farm, building a semblance of a community. Destroyed. His leg, then his life. The prison council that Rick helps establish, with its attempt at democratic decision-making and shared responsibility, shattered by outside violence. Alexandria's careful social structure, disrupted and reshaped by the arrival of Rick's group, and then threatened by the Saviours. The kingdom's feudal gentleness, broken in the war's opening movements. Every community that tries to rebuild something resembling civilization finds that the world outside the walls doesn't honour the rules inside them, and the people most committed to the inside rules tend to pay the highest price when the outside breaks through. Herschel's watch, the pocket watch he passes to Glenn, which Glenn carries for years, is one of The Walking Dead's quietest recurring objects. It's a timekeeping device in a world where the old time no longer applies. It's a family heirloom in a world that has dissolved most families. It's a small, careful continuity between what was and what's trying to be. Glenn carries it right up to the end, and then it presumably sits in the ground with him, because no one mentions it after he's gone. Think about that for a moment. The watch was meant to pass from father to son-in-law, a gesture of belonging and succession, and hope for the future. It ended in a field in Virginia with Glenn, the gesture of civilization, the passing on, the continuity, the care that one generation shows the next, was buried. While Negan walked into a cell with a window. If Herschel had been colder, if he had not trusted the possibility of the governor's humanity for even one more moment in that field, would he be alive? I honestly don't know. The governor was in a mood that day that might have found another excuse regardless. But the possibility sits there uncomfortably, that Herschel's warmth, the very quality that made him the group's most necessary moral presence, may have contributed to the specific shape of his ending. And the show doesn't resolve that. It just lets it be true, and lets you feel the weight of it, and moves on to the prison wall falling, and the ash in the air, and Herschel's daughters running. The field is empty now, and the pattern is becoming clearer. Carol Pelletier, in Season 1, is barely a presence. She moves in Ed's shadow, flinches at raised voices, doesn't take up space. She's not a named blank. She has warmth. She has love for Sophia. She has a quiet intelligence that the situation keeps suppressing. But she's not yet someone the apocalypse has made room for. She's still inside the B4 shape of who she was allowed to be. Sophia's death at the end of Season 2 is the rupture that changes everything. The barn opens, the walkers come out. And then Sophia. Small, lost Sophia, who Carol spent an entire half-season hoping and searching for, walks out of that barn with the rest of them. Already gone, already turned. Rick shoots her, and Carol stands in the field and understands something that no one else has to understand in quite that specific way. That the world took the most important thing she had, and it did it quietly while everyone was busy with other things. What Carol does with that knowledge is one of the most complete character transformations The Walking Dead ever commits to on screen. She doesn't harden immediately. It's gradual, episodic, built from one situation at a time. By season 4's premiere, she's teaching the children of the prison not just reading but weapons. Quietly, without Rick's knowledge or permission. She's already doing the calculation he won't do. These children need to know how to survive, even if surviving requires knowledge that childhood shouldn't carry. When Karen and David fall sick during the flu outbreak, Carol makes the call to burn the bodies. Alone, without authorization, because she decided the math required it. Rick exiles her for it, which is a whole other conversation. But let's note, for the theory's sake, what follows. Carol, exiled, survives everything. The prison falls without her. She finds Tyrese and the girls. She carries Judith across the Georgia countryside. She makes the impossible call at the Grove alone, without anyone to authorize her or comfort her afterward. And then she walks into Terminus in season 5's premiere and blows the wall open, alone, in a walker herd, in the rain, and saves the group that exiled her. The show rewards this Carol, not morally. It's careful about not presenting her transformation as purely good, and it gives her genuine grief about what she's become. But narratively, structurally, in terms of survival and relevance and longevity, the Carol who buries bodies is the Carol who keeps going. Her soft moments, sitting with Sophia's memory, breaking down over Henry's death in season 9, trying to love Lydia in season 10, are consistently her most dangerous. Not because love is bad, but because the grief it generates nearly destroys her. The show watches her almost lose herself to grief repeatedly. And what pulls her back every time is not further softening, but re-engagement with what she's become capable of. What would Dale say about Carol in season 6? Dale, who died arguing for the sanctity of what they were before. He would probably say she becomes something monstrous, and he would probably be right and also wrong in equal measure. Because Carol is not monstrous, she's necessary. And the show keeps those two things in uncomfortable proximity, letting you feel both at once. I don't know what's right anymore, Carol says in season 6 to Morgan, who is, at that point, holding his own version of Herschel's philosophy about the sanctity of life. She says it quietly, in a kitchen, over tea. It's one of the most honest lines in the series because it names the cost of the transformation directly. She knows what she's lost. She's chosen survival anyway, and the show keeps her alive for it, keeps finding new spaces for her to inhabit, keeps asking what this particular kind of survivor does next. Is Carol's arc a survival story? I think it genuinely is, but I also think it might be a warning, wearing a survival story's clothes. A quiet demonstration of everything you'd have to give up, and keep giving up, to be the person who makes it. And the price, Sophia, Ed's memory, the ability to simply be soft without it costing you something. That price is real, and Carol pays it, and the show doesn't pretend otherwise. That's where it starts to make sense. Or at least, it could. Negan is, by every conventional measure, the worst person to survive The Walking Dead for as long as he has. He built an empire of fear. He assigned women to himself by coercion. He used violence as governance. Not just tactically, but systematically, as the organising principle of how the Saviours operated. He killed Glenn. He killed Abraham. He made Rick crawl and made the hilltop and the kingdom bend their knees and deliver tribute. He did all of this with the cheerful specificity that the show made sure you could never entirely dismiss as simple madness. He knew what he was doing, he chose it, and then he lived, through imprisonment, through the Whisperer War, where he escaped from Alexandria's jail in Season 10, infiltrated the Whisperers, and killed Alpha, removing a threat that the group couldn't reach through conventional means. He did something genuinely useful at significant personal risk, and the show used it. It used Negan's particular capability, his ability to inhabit cruelty so completely that even the Whisperers believed him, to solve a problem that decency couldn't. Alpha dies because Negan could pretend to be a monster so convincingly that the real monster let him close enough to strike. He also saves Judith. In Season 10, during a blizzard, when the group is separated and in danger, Negan finds Judith alone in the snow and carries her to shelter. It's a small scene in a large arc, but the show puts it in deliberately. It wants you to see Negan choose the child, Rick's daughter, Glenn's killer's victim's daughter, and protect her without being asked to. And it wants you to feel something complicated about it. Here's what I notice about every moment the show uses to suggest Negan's redemption. Each one is preceded, enabled by, or only possible because of his capacity for violence. He didn't save Judith by being kind. He saved her by physically surviving conditions that would have killed a less hardened person. He didn't remove Alpha through diplomacy. He removed her because he could perform ruthlessness convincingly enough to get close. His acts of good are downstream of his acts of terrible. The show doesn't let you have Negan's kindness without also accepting that it's built on everything he did before. In Dead City, the Maggie and Negan spin-off that takes them to a Walker-overrun Manhattan, the show pushes this further. Maggie needs Negan, not symbolically, literally, operationally. She needs what he is capable of in a city full of organised human danger and overwhelming Walker population. She hasn't forgiven him. The show doesn't ask her to. But she uses him. And he goes. And in the texture of their scenes together, in the specific discomfort of their proximity, Dead City is exploring something the main show was always circling. That the future, whatever it looks like, probably has someone like Negan in it. Because the future keeps needing someone who can do what he does. Is Negan's ongoing survival a redemption arc? Some fans read it that way, and there's evidence for that reading. He has changed demonstrably. The Season 11. Negan is not the Season 7 Negan. He has grief now. He has attachments. He has things he would lose if he were lost. But the show has never rewarded him for his goodness in isolation. It rewards him for his utility. When he's gentle and gardening and quiet, he's in a cell. When he's dangerous and decisive and willing to go further than anyone else, the story opens up for him. The pattern is consistent enough to notice. So I'll ask the question directly, and genuinely, drop your answer in the comments because I'm curious what the community thinks. Is the show making a redemption argument with Negan? Or is it making a different argument, that a person like Negan never really gets redeemed, they just get redirected? And if it's the second one, what does that mean for every character we're hoping finds peace? When The Walking Dead introduced the Commonwealth in Season 11, it did something the show had been building toward thematically for years. It showed us what civilization looks like when it successfully rebuilds. The Commonwealth isn't a small community scraped together in the ruins. It's a city. Tens of thousands of people. Organised systems. A military structure, restaurants and schools, and a functioning economy. It's the old world, reconstituted. And the show watches it with a very particular, very careful eye, because the Commonwealth, rebuilt from nothing, rebuilt everything. including the hierarchies, including the class structures, including the mechanisms by which some people are protected and others are expendable. Pamela Milton runs it like an inheritance, because it is her family's vision, her family's rules, maintained through a social order that assigns your pre-apocalypse profession to your post-apocalypse status. Lance Hornsby, her enforcer, is a man who weaponizes institutional authority, who uses the Commonwealth's legitimate power structure to pursue personal agendas with deniability. He survives deep into season 11. He's manipulative and violent and efficient, and the system accommodates him because systems like the Commonwealth tend to accommodate people who are willing to do the thing the institution needs done without asking too many questions about it. Contrast. Connie. A journalist before the world ended, deaf, one of the show's most observant and perceptive characters. She notices what other people miss. She tells the truth when the institution would prefer quiet. In season 10, the cave sequence nearly kills her. She disappears into a herd, alone in the dark for long enough that the group almost stops looking. She comes back eventually. But she comes back changed, and the show never fully lets her use what she knows to change things the way a less constrained character might. Kelly, Magna. The people who exist at the margins of the Commonwealth's sanctioned structure, who don't carry the right credentials or the right social standing, are consistently in danger, consistently scrambling, consistently surviving by narrower margins than the people the institution values. The show's drawing a line here, and it's doing it deliberately. The Commonwealth's reward structure mirrors the old world's reward structure, and the people who benefited least from the old world benefit least from the new one. Pamela Milton's arc ends in the show's final stretch, without the clean accountability that the group's anger demands. She is complicit in enormous harm. She sacrificed the safety of people she was supposed to protect to maintain her power. And the ending she receives is, by many viewers' readings, softer than the one the situation calls for, whether that's the show's acknowledgement that the world rarely delivers proportional justice, or whether it's a narrative failure, probably depends on how closely you are paying attention to what the show was building. But either way, the structural argument is there. Institutions, even after the apocalypse, tend to protect the people who built them. In Here, Pamela Milton tells people when she's showing them the Commonwealth, gesturing at its lights and its order and its possibility. In Here we have a chance at something real. And she means it. She also means on her terms, under her structure, according to a hierarchy she controls. The warmth of the offer and the coldness of the conditions are held together in the same sentence, and the show trusts you to feel both. If the new world looks like the old world, the same hierarchies, the same marginalisation, the same tendency to accommodate its most useful violent actors, what did anyone survive for? It's the question the Commonwealth arc leaves open, and it's one of the franchise's most honest and uncomfortable ones. Because the answer might be, for the people you love, regardless of the structure around you. For Carol and Daryl and Maggie and the children who survived. Not for civilization, for the smaller thing, the found family, the specific people, and maybe that's enough. Or maybe it's the whole problem, and that's where the pattern starts to click. Or at least it might. Let's step back from the main show for a moment and look at what the spin-offs have been doing, because I think, across Fear the Walking Dead, Dead City, and Daryl Dixon in France, the franchise is quietly offering a corrective, or maybe a deepening, of everything the main show established about who survives and what it costs them. Madison Clark in Fear the Walking Dead is one of the franchise's most instructive parallels to Rick. She builds communities the way Rick builds communities, fiercely, protectively, with a specific vision that she holds close and a willingness to do things that she doesn't fully disclose to the people who love her. She makes hard calls. She lies when she believes the lie serves the people she's responsible for. She survives by becoming someone who can prioritize survival over principle without flinching. And she carries the cost of that in the specific way she relates to her children, to the love she has for them, and the distance her choices keep creating. Her original arc ends in a sacrifice. She locks herself in a stadium full of walkers and burns it down to give her people time to escape. It's framed as heroic, and it is, but it's also the culmination of a pattern. She took everything on herself. She carried the weight alone. And it consumed her, the way it consumed Rick at the bridge. The community she loved survived her. She didn't survive her community. The show then reversed her death, brought her back in later seasons, which is its own complicated narrative choice. But the shape of her original arc remains meaningful. A leader who loved fiercely, protected at great personal cost, and eventually found that the model of singular, self-sufficient leadership is one the world tends to eventually close its hands around. Dead City asks a different question. It takes Maggie and Negan, the two characters who most completely embody the show's tension between moral cost and survival utility, and puts them together in a post-civilization Manhattan, navigating walker hordes and organised human danger. What the spin-off explores, carefully and without resolving it, is what the future looks like when it's built by people who can't afford to be simple. Maggie hasn't forgiven Negan. She's also using him. He knows it. He goes anyway. Their partnership isn't redemption. It's pragmatism wearing the clothes of necessity. And if the franchise has a vision for how the world rebuilds, Dead City suggests it might be built by people exactly like them. Complicated, carrying enormous loss, capable of both care and violence, unwilling to pretend those things are cleanly separable. Daryl in France is the franchise's quietest argument. He's alone, in a foreign country, without the structures that defined him. No group, no Rick, no shared history that anyone around him can access. And he survives, not through declaration or strategy, but through the same thing he always used: presence, consistency, the willingness to show up and do the unglamorous thing, and then do it again. He builds connections in France the way he built them in Georgia, not by leading, but by being reliably, dependably there. His survival isn't glamorous. It's the accumulated weight of small, practical decisions made by someone who never required the world to notice him in order to keep going. The pattern across these three spin-offs, if my read is right, and this is clearly a theory, not a confirmed statement from the showrunners, is that every story the franchise tells after the main show centers someone who paid a significant moral cost to survive, not someone who avoided paying it. The post-Rick universe isn't a clean start. It's a continuation of the same moral arithmetic, carried by people who already know its price and are choosing to keep paying it anyway. Is the franchise building toward a world where the people who compromise the least are the ones who ultimately build something worth living in? I want to believe that. I think the franchise might want to believe it too. But the evidence so far suggests the road to that world runs through people like Maggie and Negan and Carol and Daryl. People who know exactly what compromise tastes like, because they've been eating it for years. Judith Grimes carries Rick's Colt Python and Michonne's katana. Let that sit for a moment. A child, a young teenager by the later seasons, but still, is walking around with the two most symbolically loaded weapons in The Walking Dead's visual language. The gun that Rick used as the extension of his authority for 8 seasons. The blade that Michonne used to carve her survival out of a world that had no reason to care whether she made it. Judith carries both. The show gives her both, and it asks you to watch her wield them with a confidence that neither Rick nor Michonne had at the beginning, as if she's been trained on their costs without having to personally pay them. There's something both hopeful and slightly heartbreaking about that. Judith has the weapons, but not the wounds. She knows the rules of the new world. She recites them. She reasons from them. She argues with adults who she thinks are applying them wrong. She's smart and she's brave. And she loves people with the same fierceness her parents did. She is, in almost every visible way, the franchise's investment in the idea that the next generation can inherit the lessons of the last one without also inheriting its trauma. That the cycle of moral compromise, the equation where survival requires shedding essential things, can be broken before it reaches the children. But here's where I want to sit with the theory, carefully, and frame this clearly as speculation rather than canon fact. What exactly are the lessons Judith inherited? Because the people who raised her, Rick, Michonne, Daryl, Carol, survived by doing things that cost them enormously. If Judith learned from their example, she learned that love is worth protecting at any cost, yes, but she also learned it from people who had become, in varying degrees, capable of things they wouldn't have chosen before the world ended. The lessons are inseparable from the people who paid for them, and whether Judith carries only the wisdom, or also the weight, is a question the show hasn't yet fully answered. The cell window, as our motif, transforms in this chapter. Negan's window, that narrow frame of light in a confined space, was the shape Mercy took in the story. A view into the world from inside consequence. Judith is not confined. She stands at the walls of Alexandria and looks outward, not in. She's not imprisoned by the past, but she's shaped by it, surrounded by the weapons and the grief and the love of people who made it through the fire and who handed her the tools without the burns. The window has opened. Whether she can step fully through it, or whether the pattern of the world will eventually require from her the same kinds of compromises it required from everyone before her, is the question the franchise is building toward. What would you do in Judith's position? If you carried those weapons, knew those lessons, loved those people, could you hold on to something they couldn't? Or would the world eventually make the same demands of you that it made of them? I think about that question more than I probably should, honestly, because I think the answer the franchise eventually gives us about Judith will be its final statement on everything we've been exploring tonight. If Judith is the answer, the narrative is investment in the possibility that the reward and punishment cycle can be broken. Then the question the show has been asking all along might be simpler than it appears. Is it possible to survive this world and stay whole? Not unchanged, not unmarked, but whole, with the essential things intact, with the capacity for warmth preserved alongside the capacity for violence, rather than slowly replaced by it. The show hasn't answered that yet, and maybe it's right not to, because a premature answer, either way, would close something the franchise needs to keep open. The possibility that Judith might make it through without paying the same price. The possibility that she might not. Both of those futures are worth the watching. And I think that's exactly what the show's counting on. Here's where I want to be careful. Because there's a version of this theory that goes too far, that turns an observation about patterns into a verdict about intention. And that's not what I'm interested in arriving at. So let me lay out both readings of what we've been looking at as honestly as I can and let you weigh them, reading 1. The Walking Dead is making a deliberate, considered argument that moral compromise is the only viable long-term survival strategy in the world it depicts. Under this reading, every death is a thesis statement. Dale dies to show us that conscience is a liability. Beth dies to show us that hope, unprotected, gets punished. Herschel dies to show us that civilization building is the most dangerous thing you can attempt. And Negan survives, and Carol survives, and Daryl survives, because the show believes, at a structural, intentional level, that adaptable ruthlessness is what the apocalypse selects for. This reading frames The Walking Dead as a tragedy with a thesis: survival at the cost of humanity, demonstrated and redemonstrated across 11 seasons and multiple spin-offs, until the message is unavoidable. Reading 2. The show kept its most compelling, most narratively generative, most dramatically interesting characters alive because they made for better television. Negan lives because Jeffrey Dean Morgan is extraordinary in the role, and because the story kept finding things only Negan could do. Carol survives because her transformation opened up narrative possibilities that the show didn't want to close. Daryl endures because he was beloved from season 1, and the show rightly didn't want to lose him. And the deaths, Dale, Beth, Herschel, Glenn, were made for maximum emotional impact at points in the story where that impact was needed. The moral pattern under this reading is an accident of good storytelling instincts, not a deliberate argument. The show kept dangerous characters alive because they were useful to the story, and the thematic resonance of that pattern is a byproduct, not a design. Here's what I find genuinely interesting about holding both of these readings at once. They're both supported by the canon, and neither is confirmed by the showrunners. Robert Kirkman and the various Walking Dead showrunners across the seasons have spoken often about character decisions, about the desire to make deaths meaningful, about the wish to honour what characters represent. But a definitive statement of thesis, yes, we are deliberately arguing that cruelty wins, or no, we are only following dramatic necessity, doesn't exist in any interview I'm aware of. The pattern is there, the intention behind it is ambiguous. And maybe that ambiguity is exactly the point. Survival stories, when they're honest, tend to resist clean moral resolution. The question of whether cruelty wins or decency endures isn't one that real history answers tidily, and a show about survival in an extreme context probably shouldn't answer it tidily either. The pattern keeps the question open. The ambiguity is what makes it possible to rewatch The Walking Dead 10 years later and still find something new in it. Because the argument is never fully made, which means it's never fully closed. Does it matter whether the show meant it? If the pattern holds either way, I think that's the most interesting question we've looked at tonight. Because if the pattern holds regardless of intent, then it's doing something to us as viewers, shaping how we think about survival, about moral compromise, about who we cheer for and why, whether or not anyone designed it to, and that's worth sitting with. Drop your read in the comments. I'm genuinely curious. Do you think the show means it? Or do you think the pattern is something it stumbled into and then kept because it worked? Because where you land on that question changes what you take away from the whole thing. And both answers, I think, are legitimate. Every pattern has exceptions, and this one does too, and the exceptions are important. Not just as counter-evidence, but as the thing that makes the pattern bearable to watch. Tyrese Williams is The Walking Dead's most complete portrait of a man who refuses to become what the world is asking him to become, and who pays for it, and whose death is framed with extraordinary tenderness. He's enormous and physically capable, one of the most physically formidable characters in the show's run. and yet he consistently struggles with killing. Not with inability, with willingness. He knows what he can do, he just can't make himself stop grieving the cost of it each time. When Karen dies in the prison flu outbreak in season 4, killed by Carol, Tyrese's grief is huge and ungovernable, and makes him temporarily dangerous in a different way. Not because he's violent, but because he's inconsolable, and the world doesn't have space for inconsolable. He dies in season 5 in the episode What Happened and What's Going On. In a sequence the show constructs as a kind of mercy, surrounded by the voices of people he loved and lost, his death hallucinatory and gentle in contrast to the brutal bite that causes it. The show couldn't let Tyrese survive in its world, not as himself. But it honoured him on the way out. It gave him a death that felt proportional to who he was, surrounded by love, even imagined love, even the love of the already dead. The pattern held, the man who couldn't harden enough didn't make it. But the show held him with care as it let him go. Father Gabriel is the exception that the pattern genuinely can't account for easily. He began in season 5 as a coward, a man who locked his congregation out of his church during the initial outbreak and listened to them die because he was afraid. He carries that guilt for years, and then slowly, painfully, without any single dramatic transformation, he becomes something like genuinely good. He learns to fight, he learns to contribute. He serves on the Alexandria Council. He makes hard choices with clear eyes. He becomes, in some seasons, one of the steadiest moral presences in the group. And he survives. He's still alive in the show's final episodes. He didn't have to shed his decency to make it. He grew into it, and the show kept him. That's worth noting clearly, and it slightly complicates the theory we've been building. In the best way, Gabriel's survival suggests that the show isn't running a pure rule where goodness always loses. It's running something more nuanced. Goodness that is naive or unprotected tends to lose. Goodness that is chosen, actively, by someone who has also accepted the cost of survival and found a way to hold both. That has a chance. Aaron is another partial exception. Consistently decent, consistently oriented toward community and fairness, and trying to do right by people. Consistently in danger. He survives, but by narrower margins than the story's more ruthless characters. And his survival tends to depend on other people's intervention at critical moments. Some fans read Aaron as the show's proof that goodness can survive with enough luck and enough friends. Others read him as proof that goodness needs to be adjacent to capability, that he makes it because he's surrounded by people who can do what he can't. Both readings feel true to me. Both say something about what the show thinks goodness is worth. Siddiq is the hardest example in this chapter. A healer, a caretaker, one of the group's most genuinely compassionate members. He was brought into the group because Carl died for it. Because Carl's mercy, his willingness to help a stranger, cost his own life and gave Siddiq his. And then Siddiq was killed in season 10 by Dante, a whisperer sleeper agent, using the specific vulnerability of his care for his patients. His goodness was weaponized against him. He was ended because he was the kind of person who would have patience, who would sit with frightened people through the night, who could be found in a predictable place doing a predictable act of mercy. What if the show's real argument, the one underneath all the pattern and all the exceptions, is simply this? Goodness survives, just barely, just enough, and always at tremendous cost, not as a punishment, as a tax. The world levies it on everyone who tries to carry both things at once, and some people pay it and make it through, and some people pay it and don't. And the line between those two groups isn't cleanly moral. It's partly circumstance, partly the people standing beside you, and partly something the show has never been willing to reduce to a formula. Let's go back to that field. The Season 8 finale. The bat on the ground. Lucille is still there in the grass when the camera drops to find her. She's been set aside. Rick has just made the call that Carl asked him to make. Extended mercy instead of ending. Chosen the future over the satisfying close of vengeance. Negan is breathing. Maggie is screaming. And the bat is just lying there, outside the frame of consequence, preserved. Here's what that image looks like now, with everything we've walked through tonight. The bat being preserved isn't the show celebrating violence. It's not the show saying cruelty wins and goodness loses, and that's the end of it. I think it's something more complicated and more honest than either of those. The bat survives because the world it represents, the specific logic of power it embodies, doesn't disappear when you choose not to use it. Lucille isn't destroyed because what Lucille represents isn't destroyable. Fear, coercion, the architecture of power built on other people's willingness to hurt. That doesn't go away because one man doesn't swing one bat in one moment of chosen mercy. It goes back to the grass, it waits. It remains available, and Negan, the cell, the window, the light coming through. We said at the beginning that the window was mercy made architectural. Confinement that still offered a view, still offered light, and that's still true. But sitting here now, with the full weight of the theory behind us, I want to offer the reframe the final chapter asks for. The window isn't a reward. It isn't the show giving Negan something Glenn didn't get. The window is consequence in a form the show rarely uses. Visible, daily, unavoidable. Negan, in that cell, can see Alexandria. He can see the community that Glenn helped build, the children of the people he terrified, the life continuing in the world his violence disrupted. He can see it. He can't touch it. Every morning he wakes up and looks through that window and lives inside the specific shape of what he did. Not as abstract guilt, but as the literal view he has to inhabit. That's not mercy as reward. That's mercy as a different kind of sentence. A longer one in some ways. The kind that asks you to stay present with what you cost the world rather than exiting it cleanly. The show isn't rewarding the worst people. I don't think that's what it's doing, even when it looks most like that from the outside. I think it's showing us with uncomfortable precision what it costs to survive. The characters who make it through the longest are the ones who found some specific way to hold the weight. Carol buries bodies and grieves in private. Daryl shows up and keeps showing up. Negan channels his capacity for violence into something occasionally useful and carries the rest in a cell with a window. None of them are rewarded for cruelty. They're just still here after cruelty. Still shaped by it, still carrying it, still choosing what to do with it each day. And Glenn is in the ground and the watch is probably still with him, and the show never gives you a clean answer about whether that was inevitable or tragic or both. It probably was both. His kindness was real, and it was also in the specific shape of that night in that field, a vulnerability the show exploited to its maximum narrative impact. That's a difficult thing to sit with. The show asks you to sit with it anyway. What got you here won't always get you there, Michonne says at one point, though the precise moment varies by which rewatch catches which line. The arc of survival in this universe keeps returning to that question. The thing that kept you alive in one chapter might be the thing that ends you in the next. The characters who endure are the ones who figure out how to keep updating what they're carrying. Not shedding their humanity, not entirely, not all of them, but carrying it differently, in smaller pockets, in moments that are nobody else's business, in the quiet spaces between the survival math. If The Walking Dead rewards cruelty, what does that say about us for watching it? For rooting for Negan's survival? For feeling relief when Carol blows the wall open? For finding Daryl's continued existence genuinely comforting? I don't think it makes us cruel. I think it makes us honest in the way the show has always asked us to be. We survive too, in the watching of it. We learn the grammar. We absorb the pattern. And then we get to choose, in our own considerably safer lives, what to do with what we know. The bat is still in the grass. The window is still open. The pattern is still there, patient and unresolved, waiting for the next story the franchise decides to tell. Maybe that's not a verdict. Maybe it's just a question, asked in the dark, by a show that trusts you enough to sit with the not knowing. That's enough, I think. That might always have been enough.